Checking San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, big tech takes on Washington as Jack Dorsey and Sheryl Sandberg testify before the Senate. How was this time different from when Mark Zuckerberg was in the hot seat? Plus, there was one big name missing from the hearings. What Senate Intelligence Committee Vice Chair Mark Warner has to say about Google being a no-show. And 23andMe's quest to cure the world's diseases, a new tie-up with Big Pharma, could provide the key to unlocking new drugs and treatments. But first to our top story, big tech takes center stage on Capitol Hill. Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey face questions from the Senate Intelligence Committee over social media and Russian election hacking. Notably absent, Google, though a symbolic third chair was left empty for the search engine, and lawmakers openly expressed their disapproval over being snubbed. Otherwise, the discourse was more civil than when Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified back in May, but Sandberg and Dorsey, though contrite, gave familiar refrains.
As a bipartisan report from this committee said, Russia used social media as part of, and I quote, a comprehensive and multifaceted campaign to sow discord, undermine democratic institutions, and interfere in U.S. elections and those of our allies. We were too slow to spot this and too slow to act. That is on us.
We are proud of how that free and open exchange has been weaponized and used to distract and divide people and our nation. We found ourselves unprepared and ill-equipped for the immensity problems that we've acknowledged.
Once that was over, Twitter CEO answered questions before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Republicans pressed Dorsey for what they believe is the shadow banning of conservatives. Earlier, Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli caught up with Senate Intelligence Committee Vice Chair Mark Warner and asked for his thoughts on the day's testimonies.
They clearly understand that this problem of Russian intervention or other foreign countries' intervention and spreading misinformation, disinformation is not going to go away. I think they're finally taking it seriously. They didn't take that for the first year after 2016 elections. Now I think they realize this is an ongoing challenge. Two, I heard a real willingness to sit down and work with us on how we can get appropriate rules of the road, not to overregulate, not to cut off innovation, but I heard, for example, from Twitter that they thought there was a validity in the point I made that should a human being have a right to know whether they're being contacted on social media by another human being or by a computer or by a bot. Doesn't have to mean that you get rid of the bots, but it does mean maybe you should have that indication.
So what's the framework look like? What does this actually look like?
There's also a question where I thought Facebook was very forward-leaning about the idea not only would they make more public which of our personal data they may be using when they sell that to advertisers, but actually help us know how much value they're getting. So if you know how much value your personal information is creating in the marketplace, more price transparency, I think that's a good thing for all involved. They also even said that they thought there were certain sites that incented violence at such a level, and we cited the example of what's taking place in Myanmar, where there's military sites that are incenting people to go out and kill the Muslim minority called the Rohingya, that they would have both a moral and a legal obligation to take down those sites. So I heard a real willingness to think about this together in a way that tries to, the wild, wild west in social media is not going to stand. There has to be some guardrails, but not in a way that cuts off innovation or American leadership.
They said that they were willing to come to the table, but what does that table look like in terms of next steps? I mean, what is the timeline here in terms of regulation, in terms of there being working groups?
Well, I think one of the things that I was proud of today was our committee showed that a lot of the folks had done some of their homework. This was not an Internet 101
I would agree.
The way some of the earlier hearings had been. But we will continue to sit down with these companies and others. One of the reasons why it was so frustrating that Google decided not to participate, which I think was a huge error on their part. But we'll sit down with these companies and say, how do we get this right in a way that at the end of the day allows users of this information to have a better judge of its accuracy, better judge of its origin, and not trying to limit people's discussion, but at least be able to have some sense of what's real and not.
I want to press you on Google in particular because you went there, you visited them, you met with these companies. For them to essentially say, we're not showing up, they were a no-show at this hearing, essentially not just saying no to the committee, but also not taking questions from the country just 10 weeks before a midterm election.
Kevin, I don't get it. I've worked with Google for years. I think they've been a very forward-leaning company. And their unwillingness to sit down and try to work with not just Congress, but for that matter, as you said, answer questions that Americans have, I think at the end of the day, it's going to hurt their reputation, not just with the policymakers, but I think with a whole lot of Google users. What do they have to hide if they aren't willing to show up and answer questions? Should
Americans trust Silicon Valley?
I'm not going to go as broad as that question.
Should they trust Facebook and Twitter?
Well, I think trust but verify.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm glad where the companies have moved. But this is not something that we're going to ever say, all right, we've totally solved the problem. Mm-hmm. The companies have gotten better. The government's gotten better at trying to figure out this foreign intervention. But the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, our adversaries are getting better as well.
That was Senator Mark Warner with Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli there. I want to walk through the day's hearings and bring in someone who recently testified before the Senate Committee on Foreign Operations in Social Media, Laura Rosenberger, co-director of the Alliance for Security and Democracy, as well as Bloomberg Tech's Selena Wang, who covers Twitter and attended the day's event. Selena, walk us through the highlights today. The room was packed. Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones was there. Interestingly, probably one of the many people interested in these discussions around shadow banning. But were there any surprises?
It's certainly been a marathon of hearings, and one of them is still ongoing. The Senate hearing, you certainly saw that the lawmakers were more prepared and quite aligned on the issues that they really wanted to hit the tech companies on. We also saw Facebook and Twitter really evolve their statements to say that this is their number one priority, to stop abuses, to stop foreign election meddling. And there were also a lot of questions about, are they adequately equipped to deal with the evolving threats? Many lawmakers brought up the new coordinated misinformation campaign that was coming from Russia and Iran. Now, in the hearing that is still ongoing, we did see the tone shift. It took a much more political tone, and we saw the Democratic and Republican lawmakers really start to divide and be quite combative towards each other. Since the Republican lawmakers really wanted to focus on alleged censorship on these platforms, while Democratic lawmakers really saw this as an invented conspiracy that Republicans are using to push their ideals in preparation ahead of the midterms. However, the conversation did steer towards several other issues, in addition to data privacy, regulation, and election interference. And Jack Dorsey has really kept his cool throughout all of this. This was his first time testifying, and it was quite impressive how he was able to methodically and in his own Dorsey-like introspective way respond to all of the lawmakers' questions.
Dorsey was perhaps more contrite than investors might have wanted him to be. We saw Twitter shares fall. We saw Facebook shares fall as well. Laura, what did you make of what we heard from both Dorsey and Sandberg? Was there any new information here?
Thanks, Emily. You know, there really wasn't much new information here. I think what we heard from them was a recognition that there's a problem, a recognition that they have an obligation to do something about it, but extremely short on specifics in terms of what that actually means. I agree with Senator Warner's assessment that we are hearing more in terms of a willingness to cooperate, potentially with government in terms of tackling this problem. One of the things that the members asked about at a couple of different points was information sharing across the platforms with one another. This is a problem that isn't confined to just one platform. These, our adversaries are using different platforms to different ends. And really, to tackle the problem, we've got to be able to pull all that information together. Jack Dorsey, in particular, came up really short in terms of saying, what they have in place to actually share that kind of information. This is nearly 2 years after the 2016 election. And we're still talking about needing to develop ways to tackle the problem rather than actually doing that in a meaningful way. That's what really concerns me.
Interestingly, they talked a bit about how they are working together. And Sheryl Sandberg, repeatedly talked about what Facebook is doing and has done to combat this behavior. Take a listen to what Sandberg had to say about inauthentic behavior on the platform.
Well, finding inauthentic behavior is a challenge, and I think you're seeing us put real resources to bear. This is why we're investing so heavily in people and technology. This is why we're investing in programs like verification. I think the other step we're taking here is around transparency.
Meantime, Selena Dorsey has talked about how Twitter just doesn't have resources at the scale that Facebook has. And so, what is the answer when it comes to Twitter? Can Twitter do anything at this point to stop these kind of threats, especially in a matter of weeks?
It's really interesting to see Dorsey sitting right next to Sandberg, who has a vast cash hoards and resources to deal with this issue. And we've heard Sandberg repeat over and over again that they have thousands upon thousands of content moderators, whereas Dorsey has failed to ever disclose how many moderators they have and where those employees are located. But he did mention that they're only in the hundreds. So yes, this is a vast discrepancy in terms of the types of threat that they're able to deal with. Now, the answer that Dorsey has been giving in terms of how they can best deal with this is relying on algorithms to better proactively identify threats, because thus far they've been relying on user reports to surface these issues of abuse. But the problem is that they're often miscalculating, they're too slow to answer to requests. So Dorsey's been repeating that they're hoping they can evolve their algorithms fast enough to deal with the threats. But obviously there's a lot of skepticism from lawmakers about whether this is adequate.
One of the interesting things that lawmakers tried to pin both of these companies down on was, are you American companies? Do you share American values, or are you global companies just trying to make money? Both Sandberg and Dorsey swayed towards the former. That said, you heard Senator Marco Rubio trying to pin Sandberg down on whether Facebook would still try to get into China. This, as we know, Google is exploring ways to get back into China. Take a listen to this exchange.
We would only operate in a country when we can do so in keeping with our values.
Right. And that would apply to China as well.
That would apply to China as well.
Interesting, Laura. It certainly seems there that Sandberg has closed the door on China, yet in the same breath, she said we can't connect the world without connecting China. What do you make of getting that kind of a statement on the record?
Yeah, I think these companies are really, in a way, at an inflection point. And I think that's something that one of the senators said towards the end of the hearing today. I mean, these companies have grown to what they are because of American democracy, because of American free market, because of American innovation. But they have also been operating as global platforms, and they have a market interest in being able to make that market as broad as possible. And so in a way, their origin story and frankly their continued existence as American companies that benefit from American laws is in a way at odds with their market interests. And I think at some point there will be a reckoning. We also see very, very aggressive investments by China in things like artificial intelligence, in terms of data acquisition, again in ways that are directly not only at odds with American values, but American national security. These are really big questions, and I'm not convinced the companies have been wrestling with them in the most meaningful way possible to really be able to put us in a footing where we're both safe, secure, and consistent with our values.
Now, I asked another tech CEO earlier today whether Google not showing up was a bad decision, and she said, I don't know, maybe it was a smart move, maybe it was a missed opportunity. I mean, was this a lose-lose situation for Google, Laura, or should they have been there?
Well, in my book, this is about actually getting to the bottom of dealing with this problem and developing solutions. And either Google wants to be a part of that or they don't. And for me, not showing up today means that they don't actually want to be part of that solution. They are absolutely a part of this problem, and any attempt to act otherwise is misguided just because they are not a, quote, social media platform. This is about manipulation of the broader online information ecosystem. There are search algorithms are gamed by RT and Sputnik and other Russian propaganda outlets. YouTube is a hotbed for Russian activity. They are absolutely part of this, and either they want to be part of the solution or they're not. And the message today that they sent was they do not want to be.
Selena, Selena, what's next? Sandberg talked about being open to regulation. It's a matter of what that regulation is. Now that these hearings have wrapped up, certainly lawmakers aren't going to stop asking questions. But, when do we see some of this stuff discussed today actually implemented in potential legislation?
It does seem that it's only a matter of time until this does become regulated. We heard the lawmakers say that the Wild West days of social media are over, and Warner recently put out a white paper with 20 different legislative ideas. That being said, none of these particular ideas have come even close to fruition, but many ideas were thrown out. Some of them included maybe putting some controls on Section 230 that have given these companies immunity essentially from any legal liability for what content users post. A lot of lawmakers brought up the issue of opioid and other illicit drugs that are being advertised on the platform, and that maybe they should be held responsible for potential deaths that come from that information. There have also been discussions about maybe a type of European GDPR data privacy law that becomes implemented here in the U.S. There's obviously also this Honest Ads Act that these companies say they are all for, which would bring more transparency to political advertising, but we have yet to see what type of regulation will come from all of this. And in this hearing that is just about wrapping up, one of the lawmakers actually derided the chairman of the House Energy Commerce Committee, saying that despite the litany of hearings that have been held over the past several months, there's almost nothing to show for it from the side of the lawmakers.
Laura, will we see action here, or is this just going to be a lot of talk?
So I think we will eventually see action, but I think there's going to be a lot of talk before that still. I do really worry, as Selena just alluded to, that in particular on some of the more partisan aspects of this issue, that it's going to be very difficult to get legislation to actually move. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced with bipartisan support in both houses of Congress, but they have not seen hearings, markups in their committees, or any kind of floor time in terms of actually moving forward. I think at this point, the chances of serious legislation moving anytime before the midterms is really unrealistic. And I think the focus has to be on how we look forward. But I absolutely agree that, the kinds of proposals that Senator Warner put forward in his white paper, they were essentially for him, some of them were rather provocative, but that's what he wanted it to be. This is the conversation our policymakers need to be having. The reality is Europe is regulating in this space. They're sort of beginning to chart the global rules. China, through its market alone, is beginning to set the global rules. If we in the United States aren't actually setting forth what a smart regulatory framework is that protects privacy, that is consistent with free market principles, that continues to allow for innovation, other countries are going to be setting the rules for us, and that's not in our interest either.
All right, Laura Rosenberger of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, as well as our very own Selena Wang, thanks so much. We're going to continue to cover this throughout the show. I do want to mention, though, that President Trump is speaking right now at the White House. He's talking about this op-ed in the New York Times written by an anonymous Trump administration official, very critical of the president's leadership. He calls it gutless, says it's a disgrace, says that if he wasn't in office, the New York Times would probably fail. More from that later on. We'll continue to monitor those headlines. And coming up, genetic testing site 23andMe has high hopes about a new partnership with a pharmaceutical giant. We will hear from the company's CEO about what could be cured in just a moment. This is Bloomberg. Genetic testing company 23andMe is hoping to leverage its technology in a partnership with pharma giant GlaxoSmithKline to develop new cures for diseases including Parkinson's. CEO and co-founder Anne Wojcicki told me why it's a dream close to her heart at TechCrunch Disrupt. Take a listen.
23andMe started with the data. So we said that drug discovery can fundamentally change if you have an incredible amount of data. And so the hypothesis we have is that if we have all this information and we discover targets that started from a human genetic component, that will have a higher success rate with drug development. So most drugs today, when they're in development, they fail. So the reason why it's so expensive to develop a drug is because 95% of everything fails. So if we can actually have a better beginning, starting with human genetics, we believe we have a higher likelihood of succeeding. So the partnership with GSK is all about helping us scale the drug development process. So we can find tons and tons and tons of ideas, but each idea is like a child. Imagine, and today we have 13 children. It's a lot. And so essentially it's like we've called in the big guns here to help us like really develop all of these programs. It's going to enable us to scale and really bring, have the potential of bringing drugs to market much faster for our customers and the whole world.
Any drugs or diseases in particular that you are
working on a
excited
whole
about?
range. I'm most excited, I'm by it because we have this genetic variant that runs in my family on the Parkinson's disease. So I'm obviously most excited is that GSK has a program going on the LRRK2 variant. So I'm really excited about that because we're going to be able to combine some of the power of what 23andMe has, which is all of our engaged customers, to the drug development that GSK had already been undergoing, specifically to this Parkinson's compound.
The FDA also approved you doing a test for the breast cancer gene,
Correct.
which is the first direct-to-consumer test.
Yeah.
How groundbreaking or impactful do you think this can really be?
I think that's huge because I think that more and more there's a trend that if you want to have good healthcare at scale, it can't always be a one-to-one through the physician. So you have to find ways to leverage the internet and leverage ways to scale information across the entire country. So this allows people to get really important, valuable, potentially life-saving information in an affordable fashion without having to have a physician or genetic counselor.
You volunteered 23andMe services to help reunite families separated at the U.S.-Mexico border. What's the status of that?
No one took us up on the offer. We had a number of people in government contact us and other groups contact us whether or not we could be part of this. And we said, like, part of our business is connecting families. So there's a lot of issues that, other people had around it. So I think fundamentally for me, 23andMe is always in that business of trying to help people improve their lives. So this was an opportunity for us to really help people, but it never came to fruition, that there was too many controversies around having us involved.
There's this question around, well, who owns that data? Could law enforcement subpoena that data?
Correct.
I mean, do you think it's a shame that it didn't?
It was a shame that it didn't happen, but again, a lot of the children have been reunited. There's all kinds of things that we can do. You can always opt people out of research, and you can opt people out of being part of the DNA relatives. It's anonymous. When you choose to spit, it's just you. There's no. We do not cooperate with law enforcement about this. We don't give your data to anyone else. So we felt like we had a good handle on privacy. But that's it. It's one of those things. We will always offer to help when there's an opportunity for us to help.
There is, though, this question of once you hand over that data, even if you have the proper consents in place, how do you prevent misuse? How do you prevent it from getting hacked? I mean, how do you think about these questions?
So the reality I always say is I love looking at your DNA, but your bank account is so much more interesting. So there's so much technology that's dedicated to protecting bank account information. So we can learn. There's tons of things that we can learn, and security and privacy security are top of mind for us because we've always said we have no business if we can't protect the data of our customers. So what we really believe is we have to do everything as a company to make sure that we are protecting your data, but at the same time we want to give you choice. So if you want to share your data with me or your mother or a friend, let's give you that choice. If you decide you want to delete your data, you can delete your data. Totally fine. So what we really want to do is allow you to have choice about how your data is being used. And it's also part of the reason why we always give you back when there's a publication that's come out of our research. We want you to know about it. So for us, the ethos of the company is about transparency. Join 23andMe, you want to share it, or if you want us to consent us for research, take a survey, we'll tell you back the results of what we've learned. We're really about empowering you to be in control and then sharing the information back with you.
Law enforcement recently used data from GED Match to track down the Golden State Killer, a serial killer that's been operating since the 1970s.
Yes.
Is that an okay use case?
So GEDmatch is totally separate from us because that's a database where people were uploading their genetic information voluntarily, and it was consented. It could be used for all kinds of different purposes. 23andMe is explicitly not consented for law enforcement. We also don't allow people to upload genomes from other places and match to see whether or not there's relatives there. So it could never happen within 23andMe.
23andMe CEO and co-founder Ann Wojcicki, fascinating uses of new genetic data. We'll have more from TechCrunch Disrupt later this hour. Coming up, Uber is rolling out new safety features that address driver and passenger security. We'll talk about them next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. It has been quite a day for big tech in Washington. Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey both answering questions asked by the Senate on Russian interference in the 2016 election. But that wasn't the end of the day for Dorsey. He went on to testify before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. This was on the potential biases that the social network might have against the Republican Party. Here's what Dorsey had to say about that.
I want to start by making something very clear. We don't consider political viewpoints, perspectives, or party affiliation in any of our policies or enforcement decisions. Period. Impartiality is our guiding principle.
Joining us now, CEO of the Internet Association, Michael Beckerman. Also in Washington, we have Bloomberg Tech, Sarah Fryer, who covers Facebook and attended the day's hearing. So, Sarah, first of all, you were at the hearings with Mark Zuckerberg as well. What is your sort of biggest takeaway here? Did anything surprise you about what Sandberg or Dorsey had to say?
Well, I think what is super clear to me at this point is that the more that senators learn about these companies, the more they want to know, the more they realize that these are very complicated algorithms, these are hard to explain policies, and that the companies are really juggling a lot of different considerations here when they make decisions over what to leave up and what to take down. And although the claims of anti-conservative bias have been debunked, it speaks to this larger discomfort over the fact that there is not a lot of public transparency about how these companies operate.
Michael, look, you work with these companies, you represent these companies. What do you think about how Sandberg and Dorsey performed in the hot seat? It certainly seems like lawmakers were better prepared, and they were better prepared as well.
They performed very well, and transparency is incredibly important for all the companies, and these two in particular, and coming up to Capitol Hill to educate policymakers and talk about the platforms and open up to any questions that policymakers have is important, and it helps educate them, and I think everybody ends up better off, and obviously a very long day for Jack Dorsey in particular.
Sarah, what do you make of the fact that Dorsey, and look, Twitter shares ended down more than 6% today. Dorsey was very contrite, almost too contrite. In fact, there was one moment where he talked about how the way that Twitter was designed 12 years ago, may just not be the way that they want Twitter to be today, and that fundamental changes are necessary to make here. Nobody sort of knows quite how to interpret that and what that means.
Well, Dorsey has said before that they're going to have to make some fundamental changes to how Twitter works, but it has a different weight when you say it under oath in front of Congress, and you're explaining that a lot of the incentives that your platform was built on, he mentioned the follower count, for example, that maybe that needs to be revisited. I mean, Twitter could completely shift its priorities to look towards a cleaner future for its users, and that could change what Twitter is. But at the same time, he mentioned how difficult that's going to be. He mentioned, for example, that it's difficult for Twitter to be able to know who is a bot versus who is a human. That was very concerning to me, because I'm thinking, if I'm an advertiser, I want Twitter to be able to tell me what people like and what they want to look for in terms of shopping. And if they don't even know if they're a human, how are they going to help me sell them ads?
Right. He talked about the difficulties of distinguishing where certain accounts are coming from. The companies talked about how they are working together. Michael, we have to talk about how Google did not show up. Lawmakers didn't miss an opportunity to talk about how they didn't like being snubbed. Take a listen to this from Marco Rubio on Google's no-show.
I want to thank you both for being here. First of all, there's an empty chair next to you from Google. They're not here today. And maybe it's because they're arrogant, or maybe it's because there's a report that, as of last night, this just posted at 3:36 yesterday, this group went on basically pretending to be Kremlin-linked trolls. They did everything. They used the details of the Internet Research Agency, which is a Kremlin-linked troll farm, and were able to buy ads online and place them on sites like CNN, CBS This Morning, HuffPost, Daily Beast. So I'm sure they don't want to be here to answer these questions.
Michael, you know how important it is for these tech companies to be well represented in Washington. Was this a big mistake? Eric Schmidt used to make these kind of appearances for Google, but Google, at this point doesn't really have someone who enjoys these kind of public interactions under the bright lights. Larry Page, the CEO of Alphabet, hasn't done a public interview in 3 years.
Look, I can't get into the negotiation between the committee and the company on who is going to come testify. Kent Walker has testified quite a few times, and I know had offered to come in and testify at this hearing. They speak in a number of different ways, and I know they did offer to testify. Maybe it was a missed opportunity, but that's between the committee and the company if they want to send somebody up or not.
Right, but Kent Walker, with all due respect, is not the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, not a founder of Google either. I mean, do you think that going forward, Google has the representation it needs in Washington as it deals with issues around trying to potentially re-enter China? The president taking aim at Google now over and over again for what he perceives as bias.
Look, there are so many different issues now that the companies are facing, and frankly, as you heard from the hearings today, they're taking a lot of proactive steps, and I give them a lot of credit for doing that, making changes and improvements to the platforms on their own. And as it relates to Google, they are very well represented both here in Washington and certainly have a number of experts back in Mountain View, and who they want to send up, that's between them and the committee.
Sarah, in terms of next steps, as the president continues to train his ire on Google, on Facebook, and on Twitter, these companies, as Michael said, are now facing a whole range of issues. Are they prepared to answer questions, not just from lawmakers, but from the administration?
I think that's going to be even tougher. Look, the DOJ came out with a statement right after the first hearings concluded, saying that they thought that maybe there was some stifling of American speech happening on these platforms. That's extremely concerning because that's a little bit more, the hearings were very cordial. They were very measured in terms of the back and forth, and the company has done a lot of behind the scenes work. Both companies have, to try to develop relationships with these lawmakers. Sandberg talked about her meetings with Mark Warner. We don't know if they have that kind of relationship with the administration or with the DOJ, and so that's going to be a completely new front for them to try to figure out how to deal with.
Michael, what do you think of this issue now that the Justice Department is taking a closer look at these companies? How much of a concern is that?
Look, it's their prerogative. They want to look into it. I think they'll find there is no censorship of political speech. It would be ironic if they want to censor speech because they said speech is being censored. Look, from the conservative point of view in particular, these platforms are open and transparent, and people are getting their voices heard. All of the policymakers that were at the hearings today are on social media every single day, both for their official accounts and campaigns. And I think it's very obvious and very clear to everybody that uses the platforms, they're open for all political parties and all viewpoints.
Sarah, I do want to ask you, the question of China came up over and over again, and it was interesting listening to Sheryl Sandberg's statements about China in particular. It sounded like lawmakers were trying to pin her down to say, no, we won't try to get back into China. Is that the way that you interpreted her response? She said, we wouldn't enter a country that didn't share our values.
And yet Facebook has attempted to enter China in other ways. They've launched apps here and there. They do have an office in Beijing that sells ads to people who want to export their products. And certainly people access Facebook still within the country via VPNs. So, they would love to be in China, let's be honest. The company there, though, is having some trouble dealing with this kind of line of questioning from the government here. The government a couple times tried to explain that they want the companies to say that they are in favor of U.S. superiority over all other countries in the world, but these are global companies, and they have to deal with governments in hundreds of countries. And so they can't just pledge allegiance to the United States without endangering their presence elsewhere.
All right, Bloomberg Tech's Sarah Frier for us in Washington, as well as Michael Beckerman, CEO of the Internet Association. Thank you both. We'll continue to discuss. Coming up, BBG Ventures, Susan Line, tackling venture capital's diversity problem and making bets on companies big and small, from startups all the way up to Amazon. And later, how defense security manufacturer Lockheed Martin is looking to drone racing for the next AI breakthrough. We'll hear from the company's chief technology officer. This is Bloomberg. President of ABC Entertainment, CEO of Martha Stewart's media company, and CEO of Gilt. Susan Line has worn many hats in her career, and she's greenlit hits like Grey's Anatomy and Desperate Housewives, and led brands like TechCrunch and Engadget. Today, she wants to see more women at the top. She now leads Built by Girl Ventures, or BBG, a venture capital firm that looks for companies with at least one female founder, and happens to be a big investor in Amazon, which just hit $1 trillion. Susan, thank you so much for joining us back here on the show.
Thank you. I would say I am a tiny investor in Amazon, and not through BBG Ventures.
But you personally invested in Amazon.
Yes, exactly.
I believe in 2009?
Yes.
Was it? And then again this year.
Correct.
So what do you think about hitting $1 trillion?
I think that's a nice story. Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that they're a very unique company. You know, they're a tech company, they're a commerce company, they're a media company, and they've really diversified in ways that I think most tech companies have not. And additionally, they've created an ecosystem, or a flywheel, that is brilliant, that moves people from one part of their ecosystem to another very seamlessly.
So there's been a huge run up in the shares in the last 3 years. So the stock has exploded, but really quickly. Does that concern you? That this could be the top, a plateau?
You know what? I don't think it's the top. I think when you look at, it's a very highly valued stock. Let's be fair. But I do think that there's still a lot of room there. When you think that e-commerce is still only about 15% of all commerce in the country, and they are the dominant player in that space. As it expands more, they're going to benefit from that. And I think they're also one of the few companies out there where you can say they're not going to be profoundly impacted by the trade wars.
Interesting. I want to ask you about that. I do have a chart here in my GTV library comparing Apple to Amazon. What about the threat of regulation? What about the fact that Amazon is in the president's crosshairs?
Yeah, well, I think it is, but I think the other thing to remember about Amazon is that they support and they enable thousands and thousands of small businesses around the country. So you go after Amazon, and you're going after really the mainstay of the president's support system. So I think he will think long and hard about how and when he goes after them.
Now, you know what it's like to run an e-commerce company that's competing with Amazon. Today we saw J.Crew, the J.Crew Mercantile line, actually partner with Amazon. So you can now get J.Crew products on Amazon, which is kind of surprising. Do you think that's the only choice for a retailer today, is to work with Amazon, not against it, or is this going to be in isolation?
No, I think that there are lots of different options for both retailers and for brands, right? So one of them is definitely to use that Amazon platform because you can reach an enormous number of people, but there are plenty of brands that are doing very well by going directly to consumers, and those are among the companies we back as a VC firm. There's no question that there's a lot of things Amazon does really well. One of them is not necessarily developing brand strength. And so for companies like Warby Parker and Casper and and Glossier, they've developed a direct relationship with their consumer. It's an emotional connection, and it keeps that customer with them, I think, for longer and on a more consistent basis.
So let's talk about BBG. You came on the show when you launched this fund. The goal is, every company has a female founder. Have you found that to be a competitive advantage?
Yes, 100%. One of the reasons that we launched BBG Ventures was that we knew that women were the dominant consumer. We are either responsible for or have the last word on 85% of all consumer purchases in every part of life. It's not just fashion and beauty. It is what healthcare plan you use. It is what insurer you choose. It is where you buy your house. All those things, women are the dominant force in. So it just made sense to us to back entrepreneurs who understood that end user and who were going to speak her language. We're going to know where to find her and how to delight her, how to serve her needs.
Now, despite the fact that there are people like you out there making bets on women-led companies still get 2% of venture capital funding. Yeah. And I have a lot of investors say to me, we're looking hard, but we can't find them. What are they doing wrong?
Well, they aren't really looking. We've seen over 4,000 companies since we launched 4 years ago, all with a female founder. I think that organizations like Allraise, which I imagine you've covered, but Allraise is doing fantastic work in that space. In fact, they're going to be at TechCrunch Disrupt.
That's trying to get more women into venture and more women funded.
Correct, exactly. And I think that there are lots and lots of women out there starting businesses. The problem is that the VC world right now is still dominantly male. 91% of all VC partners are male. So that impacts the way that venture dollars get invested. And it may seem like it's an arcane part of the finance world and not really that important, but it is. I mean, truly, venture capital has a much bigger impact than you would think. If you look back over the last 44 years, 42% of all the companies that went public during that period of time were venture-backed. So if we want to have a more diverse ecosystem of companies out there, if we believe that a more diverse group of entrepreneurs is going to come up with better solutions, then we've got to find ways for more venture capital to go to women.
You are the king and queen makers of Silicon Valley, if you will, and I know you're in town for TechCrunch, so be looking out, looking for new people to bet on. So thank you so much for stopping by. Always great to have you here on the show. Okay, coming up, we'll have more of Bloomberg Technology. We will be right back. This is Bloomberg. Defense contractor Lockheed Martin is looking to drone racing for the next advance in artificial intelligence. Here's Lockheed Martin Chief Technology Officer Keoki Jackson to talk about this from TechCrunch Disrupt.
This is an autonomy and AI challenge and bringing that to the world of high-speed flight. So we're partnering with NVIDIA and the Drone Racing League to compete essentially the best AIs against the best human drone pilots. So for anybody that's seen drone racing on TV, we're raising the bar there and we're raising the excitement level. We're challenging people out here at the conference today and around the world to develop the technology that will allow an autonomous drone to meet and beat the very best human pilots in a complicated drone race.
So there will be no human intervention here, right?
So once it goes, it has to work on its own. It's what we call edge computing and using that edge AI capability to navigate and complete the course as fast as possible. And these are speeds upwards of 80 miles an hour.
So talk to us about what kind of tracks you're going to use and the technical challenges of actually making this possible at this point.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I mean, like I said, this is all about putting really complex and high-power computing into a very compact, lightweight, low size, weight, and power device at the edge. And so these are small drones, right, moving at very high speeds. They're going into, if you've seen on TV, these drone racing courses, these are complicated 3D courses where they have to maneuver around obstacles and they have to be able to complete the course in the fastest time possible. Ultimately, we're going to compete these machines and the AIs that the folks out here develop against those very top human drone racing pilots.
And what kind of tracks are you using? Is this normal tracks?
Yeah, so we're going to use tracks comparable to what the actual pilots are using in Drone Racing League today.
Lockheed Martin likes to say it's been in Silicon Valley since before Silicon Valley was Silicon Valley, but some say this might be an odd fit for a defense company. How do you respond to that?
Well, again, the challenges that we face, whether it's defense-related challenges or it's putting people back to the moon and out to Mars, these are incredibly complex challenges. They're very, very difficult missions in very difficult environments. They require a whole range of technologies. And so to meet those mission challenges, we need to be bringing in not just the very best talent from around the area here, but we're looking to partner with companies that have new ideas, whether it's in autonomy and AI, sensors, machine learning, quantum information sciences. These are the technologies that are going to bring the next advances to these mission capabilities.
So do you think you'll find technology that Lockheed Martin could help develop?
Absolutely, and we're looking to work with and to collaborate with small companies through large companies. We're actually out here on the floor today at TechCrunch. We've got representatives from our Lockheed Martin Ventures Fund, this is a $200 million venture fund, who are looking for companies that have commercial and interesting technologies that are going to apply to this whole range of challenges from undersea to deep space.
You know, we talk a lot about self-driving cars, but, you know, in reality, they're probably a long way off. Are we farther along when it comes to flocks of drones that can be controlled by, you know, a piloted plane, you know, with or without human interaction?
Well, let me give you just a couple of examples, and I'll use one in the military. We actually, you'll recall a few years ago, there was a big problem with improvised explosive devices harming troops in Afghanistan. Our engineers said, hey, we think we have technology that can deal with that. And we ended up deploying 2 autonomous cargo helicopters, K-MAX helicopters. They did over 1,700 missions, autonomously delivered over 4 million pounds of food, supplies, and cargo. And those are the kinds of capabilities that exist today. And then on the commercial side, we're actually developing what we call a matrix technology. Think autonomous full-scale helicopters. We've been doing that for the past 5 years for things like operating in zero weather conditions in oil platforms in the North Sea, or being able to autonomously detect a forest fire, send a helicopter out to rescue somebody, and another helicopter out with a water bucket to put the fire out.
Lockheed Martin CTO Keoki Jackson speaking to me earlier at the TechCrunch Disrupt conference. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.